This month's topic is a World Parliamentary Assembly, and I'm just going to read for you, if I can find that. This is what Joe Schwartzberg wrote about the idea of a World Parliamentary Assembly. He says, "I firmly believe that a World Parliamentary Assembly would be the best way to allow for citizen input in global governance. Providing the diverse strands of humankind with a meaningful voice in making the decisions that will shape their destiny will do more to legitimize the UN than any other reform that I can envisage." So obviously he's a huge supporter. In fact, the Workable World Trust is a large financial supporter of the campaign for United Nations Parliamentary Assembly. And our speaker today is actually the co-founder and the director of the campaign for United Nations Parliamentary Assembly, as well as the co-founder and co-director and director, I should say, of Democracy Without Borders. He may say a little bit more about that. He's also been a member of the Council of the World Federalist Movement Institute for Global Policy since 1998. And most recently, he has co-authored a book, which I'm in the midst of reading. I encourage all of you to get that as well. A World Parliament, Governance and Democracy in the 21st Century. This was originally written in German, and it was translated into English and just published in April in English. And Andreas has been attending various book launches for that. Andreas is also a dear friend, certainly to me and to many of us, or a number of us on this call. So I'm very pleased to have Andreas joining us today. What I'm going to do right now is mute everyone, and then Andreas can unmute himself. He's going to give us maybe a 30-minute overview, and then we'll have plenty of time for question and discussion, any ideas that all of you have. I'm noticing that Michael Tierney from St. Louis has joined. Thank you. Good to see you. Okay, so let's see. I'm looking for how it is that I mute people. Mute all. I should have looked this up. Here we go. Okay, so and Andreas, you'll have to unmute yourself then, okay?
Right, good. Okay.
Okay, I just unmuted you. Yeah. Actually, that worked. Okay, go ahead.
Right, can everybody hear me now? It seems like that's the case. Okay, then first, good morning or good afternoon, depending on where you are right now. I'm very happy to join this discussion today, and thanks so much, Nancy, for the kind introduction. This is part of the book seminar that is dealing with Joseph Schwartzberg's Transforming the United Nations book. And as Nancy said, there are several sessions dealing with separate chapters of the book, and today we will be dealing with the chapter on a World Parliamentary Assembly. As Nancy indicated, I've been dealing with this topic for a long time, like Joe himself, but also in very practical terms as a co-founder and director of this international campaign for a UN Parliamentary Assembly. And I've been working with Joe and Nancy also for many years. And as Nancy mentioned already also, the Workable World Trust that Joe established in 2014 is also now one of the major supporters of the campaign for a UN Parliamentary Assembly, and also of Democracy Without Borders, which is the host organization of the campaign in Berlin. I may be talking a little bit more about this, meaning Democracy Without Borders, later in the end, but I think what I will be doing first is, of course, to try to give you an overview of this chapter number 3 in Transforming the United Nations System of Joe's book, which is dealing with the topic of a World Parliamentary Assembly. So we have an idea about Joe's proposals that he's been elaborating on in the book. And after that, I may provide some of my own comments on this, and later in the end say a little bit about what has been going on in terms of the international campaign and what important next steps might be. And then we will have a lot of space for discussion amongst ourselves. And as far as I am able to, I am, of course, very happy to answer any questions you might have. And I may add also that it would have been fantastic if Joe had been able to attend himself and present this chapter in person. Well, he's not able to do so, which is very unfortunate. But please, Nancy, I think it is fair to say that we all would like you to transmit our best wishes and greetings to him when you have an opportunity to talk to him again. Right, so as Nancy indicated, Transforming the United Nations System, Joe's book was originally published in 2013 by UN University Press, and there are a couple of chapters in there that are in fact interrelated to a large degree. So I guess that at least in the discussion we may be touching on other topics as well, not necessarily only a World Parliamentary Assembly. So there are 15 chapters, and I'm saying this also for those who have not yet seen the book, which I believe might be the case. So there are 15 chapters dealing with the reform of the UN General Assembly, with the establishment of a World Parliamentary Assembly, with Security Council reform, reform of the Economic and Social Council of the United Nations, dealing with establishing a credible human rights system, strengthening the global judicial system, better system-wide coordination, engaging civil society for civil society coordination groups, improved funding for the UN system, effective peacekeeping, and finally, it deals with a new architecture of global governance. I think it's just good that we have an idea that, you know, this book is really dealing with the whole system and has an overarching approach. And this is, in fact, I believe, important in terms of the World Parliamentary Assembly proposal, because it certainly is not an end in itself, but the reason why Joe, I believe, and me too, why we promote this body is because we think it will be a key element in a broader architecture that will allow the UN or a successor organization to deal more effectively and with more legitimacy with the global challenges of our time. Well, the book, as Nancy has mentioned, was translated, I think, into 8 languages by now, and the German edition was translated by myself. So there's proof, proof that I actually read it in detail. And well, I'm kidding, but the UN Association of Germany has established a working group on UN reform last month. And it may be noteworthy to say that this working group is using Transforming the United Nations System, namely the German edition, as a starting point of its discussions. And I hope that there will be good recommendations coming from this working group. Actually, the goal is that the UNA Germany's recommendations will be taken up by other German NGOs. So my vision is that at the beginning of 2020, there will be recommendations on the UN reform coming out of German civil society based on Joe's book, right? I mean, I can't tell, of course, at this point what these recommendations will look like, but it's interesting, you know, that it's not just in this sense an academic work, but it's informing, I believe, political debates. And this is one example. The most important premise of the book, I think, is that the design of decision-making institutions, and that's a quote from Joe's book, has an important bearing on the quality and legitimacy of the decisions they make. So basically, Joe's book is focusing on an improvement of decision-making procedures and decision-making institutions within the UN core organization and the other UN entities, in order to put the UN into a position in the long run of actually adopting binding global legislation and putting it into a position of implementing decisions. The starting point, in addition to this, is in Joe's book, The Democratic Deficit of the United Nations. And I will need to elaborate a bit on what that means in Joe's understanding, but not only in his understanding. And I mean, I would have to mention at this point maybe that I am aware that some of our listeners today, they are experts on global governance issues and have been dealing with this for decades themselves. But then again, we may have listeners here who are not that common with the ideas in the book and the proposals. So I'm actually, you know, providing an overview, and later in the discussion, if need be, we can actually delve into technical details and other things. But at this stage, I believe it's important that we have an overview that is not based on prior knowledge, expert knowledge. Well, having said that, let me continue to present this idea of a democratic deficit of the UN. Firstly, which is probably the most important point, it's about the principle of one state, one vote. That's based on the idea in international law of, you know, the sovereign equality of states. And the result of this is, and it's an example that you will find in Joe's book too, that countries such as China and Nauru, the largest and the smallest ones on the planet, do have an equal say and seat and vote in most UN bodies, meaning that China's 1.3 billion citizens have one seat in the UN General Assembly, and Nauru's 9,300 citizens have also one seat represented through their government, which means that there is a ratio of 150,000 to 1 if we compare it to the population size. And Joe and other experts have been saying for a long time that this imbalance between member states of the UN that are so different, but at the same time formally treated in an equal way, is one of the main dysfunctions in the system of the UN, UN's decision making. So basically, this you will find throughout Joe's book. He is trying to find a better balancing through weighted voting, so that the actual demography, population size, economic weight, and so on are better reflected in the representation and decision-making system of the UN. One other example, what that means, the current state, is that it is possible for the 129 smallest countries in the world represented in the UN, with a combined population of only 8% of world citizens, to command a 2/3 majority in the UN General Assembly and other bodies. So from a cosmopolitan point of view, where the starting point is an equal weight of every world citizen, this is certainly not a democratic state of affairs. And the situation is worse, which is the second main point when we refer to the UN's democratic deficit, when we look at how these people are actually, you know, constituents and populations are represented at the UN, because it is exclusively a representation through diplomats appointed by the executive branches of UN member state governments, which means that opposition, minority, you know, political opposition and minority representatives are automatically not included in the UN's representation system. And that's what Joe actually points out in chapter 3 of his book at the very beginning, that actually, you know, the UN Charter has been adopted and proclaimed in the name of we, the peoples of the United Nations. But if you look at the Charter there, it does not provide for any instrument or means to actually represent these people beyond through their national government. So that's, to summarize, I believe, the two main points concerning the UN's democratic deficit. They have, of course, implications that I don't want to go into detail now, but that's essentially the one state, one vote principle, and then the fact that representation is only going through appointed career diplomats. Right, so this was like opening remarks concerning Chapter 3, why is it important to have a World Parliamentary Assembly from the perspective of the UN's democratic deficit. But then again, there is another perspective that comes into play, which does not necessarily connect with the principle of democracy, but with the question of governance and the UN's ability to adopt binding regulation. Because the premise here is that if the UN, which Joe thinks indeed is the case, should have the ability and power to adopt binding global legislation, then the system needs to be as legitimate and democratic as possible. So the other point here is that World Parliamentary Assembly would have to play a role in a system of global lawmaking. And insofar, Joe also quotes Article 21 of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, starting from the idea that the UN system already, in certain ways, represents a system of governance. And this Article 22 then says, the will of the people shall be the basis of the authority of government. And if you look further into the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, you will see that it actually elaborates on what that means, namely that there need to be free and fair elections of such representatives, you know, that actually on whom the authority of government is based. So basically, there are 3 stages that Joe explains in his chapter on the World Parliamentary Assembly, and I think this is really a good and important approach that you will have to, you know, take into account if you want to understand the proposal. And, you know, the World Parliamentary Assembly is also, this term is a synonymous term also for a UN Parliamentary Assembly. So we are basically not talking about 2 different kind of bodies and things, but it's basically the same. And in my talk, I will be referring to a World Parliamentary Assembly and the UN Parliamentary Assembly, I guess, in a synonymous way. And this procedural approach, saying that we have a first step and then successive steps towards a vision, that is also included in Joe's book. It's also a basic and fundamental concept behind the UN Parliamentary Assembly and the campaign. So what I will be doing is I will be briefly presenting to you the 3 stages that Joe has included in his book. Well, stage 1 would be a body established by the UN General Assembly according to Article 22 that has only advisory and consultative powers. Joe suggests that before that happens, there needs to be a preparatory process, of course. And he mentions that the UN should establish a high-level panel that would deal with an acceptable design of a World Parliamentary Assembly. So before we talk about a decision according to Article 22, I believe there will be preliminary processes and decisions happening at the UN, of course, to set the whole train in motion. And according to Joe, that would be an important point would be this high-level panel that would look into the designs and prepare the statutes. One thing that Joe has included in his book is that he believes that an Article 22 decision would have to be taken by a 2/3 majority. And maybe for those who are not expert with Article 22 and these things, that's a norm in the UN Charter that allows the UN General Assembly to establish subsidiary bodies as it thinks are required to fulfill its work. So there are many bodies that have been established on that basis, and the UN Parliamentary Assembly could be one of them. As I say, and that's not just a technical detail, Joe believes that a 2/3 majority is necessary because that's what the Charter says about so-called important decisions. And well, I will comment, you know, my own views later, and I hope I will not forget to come back to this 2/3 majority thing, because I believe actually that maybe a simple majority would be sufficient. But okay, so to recap, it would be an only advisory body with consultative powers established by the General Assembly, and now that's a key element for the first stage. It would be composed of members of parliament elected by the legislators of member states of the UN. And Joe suggests a formula for the apportionment of seats that establishes a compromise between population size, economic weight, and the principle of sovereign equality. I don't want to delve into the technical details of weighted voting and apportionment formulas right now, but the important takeaway here is that Joe believes that we do have to take different factors into account when it comes not only to the apportionment of seats in the World Parliamentary Assembly, but also to voting in the UN generally. And these are the three main factors that he suggests should be included in any formula, namely, to say it again, population size, economic weight, and the principle of sovereign equality. Well, and for stage 1 of chapter 3 for the World Parliamentary Assembly, that there would be, you know, a total of 564 seats according to his mathematic formula and approach, with 57 going to the United States, which would be roughly 10%, and 55 to China, 39 to India, 20 to Japan, and 15 to Germany. And then 114 nations, according to Joe's formula, would have only 1 seat. And still, collectively, they would represent 6.8% of the world's population, but would still account for 20.2% of seats. So, although Joe believes that the weight of micro states needs to be decreased, in stage 1, they would still have a relatively strong position in this design of the World Parliamentary Assembly. Right, let me quickly see what, yeah. Okay, so another important element in the proposal is that seats would be assigned in proportion to the breakdown of parties within the legislatures they come from. So in larger countries, or let's say countries with 2 seats, there would be 1 seat for the ruling party and 1 for the opposition party. This is a key, really, I need to stress it again, a key element in the proposal, because the whole idea of the World Parliamentary Assembly is to improve citizen representation at the UN, and this means in specific terms that a broader political spectrum is represented. So let's say, for example, if it was only ruling parties represented in the World Parliamentary Assembly, we would de facto have a kind of duplication of the General Assembly, and that's not what the proposal is about. It's really about including opposition voices and minorities for the first time in the UN. So, and then this is connected with another basic and key element in the proposal, namely that the number of seats would be assigned by nations, but the seating of delegates would be along party lines individually. So there wouldn't be, ideally a Chinese or Indian voting bloc or even a US voting bloc, but individual delegates would freely choose which political group in the World Parliamentary Assembly they would like to be part of. So there would probably be a conservative group, a liberal group, a socialist, social democratic group, and so on. And this is another key element of the proposal, because it would allow the Parliamentary Assembly to work transnationally and to depart from geopolitical thinking and geopolitical groups like you would find them today at the UN. So that the political groups, transnational in nature, in the World Parliamentary Assembly would be able to look at solutions and regulations for global problems from a transnational perspective, and not from the perspective of what would be in the best interest of their own nation. Right, the work of the World Parliamentary Assembly would be basically handled by plenary, but importantly by committee meetings. So we are not necessarily talking about, you know, large and very long plenary meetings, as these would be prepared by smaller, more expert committee meetings, like it is usually the case with all parliaments that exist. And I think this is an important aspect that always needs to be taken into account. Also, one thing I don't want to miss to mention is that Joe says that reform-minded national parliaments, even in the first stage, could authorize popular election of their nation's members of the World Parliamentary Assembly. So that, and this is, by the way, also a position that the UNPA campaign has taken, so that we would probably, in the mid-term, end up with an assembly with a hybrid composition, meaning that some members, most members probably still would be coming and elected from the midst of national or regional parliaments, whereas others from progressive countries would be actually popularly elected. So we would end up with an assembly with a core group of democratically elected, directly elected members, and others surrounding them with less democratic legitimacy. And I think there's a lot you know, of benefits having such a hybrid assembly, because we would expect that this would create a momentum for increasing popular election of the delegates. I only want to mention in brief that Joe also stresses the importance of the establishment of an independent electoral commission that would oversee all technicalities concerning, you know, for example, the certification of the number of seats, or rules of fairness, electoral practices, and funding, and such things. So I will speed up my talk a little bit and come, yes, I am aware that we need to do that, I think, and come to stage 2. At this stage, Joe foresees that in conjunction with the UN General Assembly, the World Parliamentary Assembly will be gradually empowered to participate in adopting binding global legislation in important matters of global concern. So in this stage 2, the Assembly would not just be an advisory or consultative body, but it would actually, with the UNGA, the General Assembly, become part of the world legislative system. This goes along with increased democratic legitimacy. Namely, Joe says that at this stage, all members of the World Parliamentary Assembly would have to be elected by popular voting and no longer come from national parliaments. This is also coincidentally a position, again, that has been adopted by the UN Parliamentary Assembly campaign, because there's a lot of, you know, concern with a body that has limited or even, you know, doubtful democratic legitimacy that would be able to adopt binding global laws. So we believe that that's at least the current state of affairs, that there is this connection between democratic legitimacy and what power such an assembly may have, right? And this is, again, that can be found, this connection, in Joe's book in stage 2. Well, and then he suggests that large countries would be divided into electoral fields with their own party slates of candidates. And seats would be assigned a weighted vote to reflect the number of constituents in a better way. So at this stage 2, we wouldn't only have a system for the apportionment of seats that would be connected to population size, economic weight, and equality of nations. But in addition to this, those seats coming from this apportionment formula then would again be, you know, connected to a certain weighted vote that is, you know, coming from especially the population factor. But nevertheless, and I said before that I wouldn't like to go into these technical details today, but nevertheless, we would still have a system of so-called digressive proportionality, which means that small countries would have more seats per capita and more voting power per capita than larger ones. And then Joe points out that in stage 2, qualified majority voting is the key for the Parliamentary Assembly to be able to be an effective decision-making organ. He also mentions in this context that World Parliamentary Assembly might be a politically potent body for so-called people's veto vis-a-vis the Security Council and other UN bodies. So, and this is something I might have added at the very beginning also, that basically the citizen elected body is conceived of as a counterbalance to existing bodies also, like the Security Council especially. Stage 3 would be the next, which is still further in the future. Here, Joe foresees the implementation of the principle of one person, one vote, so that each seat in the World Parliamentary Assembly approximately would represent the same number of constituents. This is far in the future without Joe providing a timeline, which is reasonable not to do. But the idea is that in this hypothetical World Parliamentary Assembly with 1,000 seats, and then a world population of 10 billion people, each seat would represent around 10 million constituents. And then the key to achieve this is that there would be electoral fields across the world that in many cases, you know, would ignore today's national boundaries, because as pointed out before, countries are so different in their size demographically, it would be necessary to achieve the goal of similar sized constituencies to merge countries and to find electoral districts or fields that are transborder in nature. So this is basically the 3 stages that Joe suggests, and I think in the discussion it would be wonderful for those who read the book if they would like to, you know, provide more details or say things I forgot in my presentation, so that we have a broader and better view than what I could present. But as I promised at the beginning, I will also, if you allow, provide my own personal comments on what we find in the book in terms of proposals, and then also talk a little bit about the ongoing international campaign. So if you agree, I would still be talking like 5 or so minutes about these things, starting with my comments. I guess, I mean, for me, it's always important that we are aware that the idea of a UN Parliamentary Assembly or a World Parliament, they are not new. You know, UN Parliamentary Assembly specifically was first suggested in 1948 by the US-American lawyer Louis Sohn, when the Council of Europe was created with a treaty body, namely the Parliamentary Assembly of the Council of Europe. And at that time, it was argued, well, if that is possible within the Council of Europe, we can do the same at the UN. So the UNPA idea goes back to 1948. And the idea of the World Parliament goes even back specifically, really, in express terms, to the time of the French Revolution. So it's really more than 200 years old. And in the last 200 years and longer, there's been a growing, you know, pile and mountain of literature that's been dealing with the World Parliament idea. And if you allow, I may mention this at this point in the book that Nancy mentioned before, a World Parliament that was published by me and Jo Leinen just in April. Here it is again. In this book, the first chapter on 120 pages really digs into the historical details, and we made a lot of effort to find all relevant literature and voices speaking out for World Parliament since the French Revolution. And you will be surprised what we could find out in what you can find in the book. And many, surprisingly, many of the discussions we still have today, like how to deal with undemocratic countries, or at that time monarchies. These are by no means new discussions. We can find literature, extensive literature about it already in the 19th century. So that was for me a big surprise, and I think we can profit and benefit in big ways if we look at what has been discussed so far. So I think we don't need to do everything from scratch. Stage one that Joe suggests in transforming the UN system is a common approach, like it is also endorsed by the Campaign for a UN Parliamentary Assembly, with one major difference, nevertheless. And the difference is that I believe the idea of weighted voting, or rather a formula that includes economic weight, population size, and sovereign equality, is something that is pretty unique at this stage, right, of a World Parliamentary Assembly, at least in practical terms. As I mentioned, there's a lot of literature, and even in the 19th century, there was talk about including economic weight in some formulas. But in political reality, I believe this is quite unique, and nevertheless, what has been agreed on in the Campaign for a UN Parliamentary Assembly is that the seats in the UN Parliamentary Assembly should actually be allocated based on the principle of digressive proportionality. Again, it means that smaller countries would have more seats per capita than larger ones. And an important example to draw on is the European Parliament, where the system is just like that. Then one important point included in Joe's book is that he believes a World Parliamentary Assembly should be open to all countries, irrespective of government type. This is something I strongly agree with also, and this has been a contentious issue since the 19th century, how to deal with monarchies at that time and today undemocratic countries. And this is something we may like to discuss later, but from my point of view, the whole issue begins with how to say what's a democratic country and what's not. So the whole definition of what is a democracy and what's not a democracy is highly problematic. So if we say only democratic countries should be represented, we are opening a box of, a box that we may not close again, and then again, who decides whether this is the case or not, that a particular country is a democracy or not? I think that is just something we don't want to establish as a, measurement when we talk about the UNPA. So the idea is all countries should be able to participate, all UN member states. And, the problem is kind of solved with this premise that as powers grow of the Parliamentary Assembly, its democratic legitimacy has to grow as well. So as long as it's only an advisory body, it is argued that if there are some delegates coming from, undemocratic countries, whatever that is, it's still an advisory body. And once it is, directly elected through free and fair elections, then only we are in a position to say, all right, we are at a stage where the powers can actually be increased in a big way. Just a few more points, if you allow. There are also other methods for the establishment in international law. It's not only this Article 22, but there are strong voices who advocate that it could be created on the basis of an international treaty, or even based on a charter review process according to Article 109 of the charter. You know, all of this, I think, implicates certain issues and problems. No way is really a perfect way, but in my assessment, in my personal assessment, really, Article 22 is still the best way we can go. Because if we choose an international treaty, the question remains, how do we connect this body with the actual processes and decision-making mechanisms at the UN, right? Because if it's an independent treaty organization, there is no such connection. It would have just a symbolic importance. And so to establish this connection, there would have to be a treaty, again, an intergovernmental treaty between the UN and this new assembly that points out what rights and functions the assembly would have inside the UN. And here, this is again a decision by the General Assembly. So we can cut out this whole step of an international treaty at this stage and begin with a General Assembly resolution in the first place. Having said that, in the book by Jo Leinen and me, you will find in the last part that we do advocate an international treaty to establish a UN Parliamentary Assembly. But this is in a later stage when it is necessary to create also connections to such institutions that are not part of the system today, like the international financial institutions or the World Trade Organization, because then we do need a treaty, or we have to change the treaties the World Trade Organization is based on and the other institutions to give this assembly a function, an institutional function. There are still a few important points I need to, I think, cover, and but I will really be quick. There are, I think, a couple of supporting trends for our work. I mean, we are all aware about the general political situation today we are in. So generally, I would say that in the past 5 years or so, especially in the last 2 years, the situation has become more problematic in terms of the general political environment. But at the same time, you know, paradoxically, just because of this, it seems that there is now more open-mindedness amongst some actors out there concerning the UN Parliamentary Assembly project. And I believe it has to do with the fact that they see that multilateralism and the UN are really under threat, and that they need to do something to increase the UN's connection with the world citizens, its popular, you know, perception, and really its overall legitimacy. And I mean, I don't want to say too much in terms of expectations, but I can sense that there is kind of, at least in progressive quarters, there's a kind of shift going on. That's not too much to say. So one of these trends is certainly the proliferation of international parliamentary institutions since the end of the Cold War. An international parliamentary institution, that's a body that is composed of elected representatives, and like national parliamentarians, but the European Parliament is also an international parliamentary institution, or the Pan-African Parliament, you know, which is a body of the African Union. So a study that was carried out by one of my colleagues in 2011 at that time, you know, for 1990, she counted 40 international parliamentary institutions, and 20 years later, when she wrote the study, she counted 140 of these institutions. So you know, some of you might have heard about the Interparliamentary Union, which is the umbrella organization of national parliaments worldwide, and it's one of the oldest international organizations. It was created in 1889, and for a long time, it was said that, you know, the parliamentary dimension at the UN, that's taken care of by the IPU. But the situation, that's really an important point we can make now, is that there are so many international parliamentary institutions, and it needs to be justified now why it should be exclusively the Interparliamentary Union that is managing the UN's connection with parliamentarians and national parliaments specifically. So this is the one trend. And let me quickly look at my notes. Right, and the other trend certainly is that we have this whole discussion going on about the Sustainable Development Goals. And here, you know, it is important that there is parliamentary oversight, and you know, parliaments are also, and parliamentarians are needed for the implementation of the Sustainable Development Goals. So here, you know, we can connect our program or project or proposal with this ongoing, you know, SDG process. And it's not only that we would need oversight and implementation through parliaments, but also SDGs, the SDG 16, specifically 16.6 and 16.7 say that there should be effective, and I'm quoting, effective, accountable and transparent institutions at all levels. And then another quote, there should be responsive, inclusive, participatory, and representative decision-making at all levels. And I'm emphasizing at all levels because it implies, you know, Sustainable Development Goal 16 implies that there should be transparent and representative decision-making at all levels, including the global one then, right? So this is something we really can connect with, so to promote a parliamentary body at the UN. If you allow, Nancy, just a few minutes more about the campaign, right? Okay, so, you know, the campaign for UN Parliamentary Assembly was created in 2007, and we did not start from scratch, but from the beginning the idea was that what we want to do is to bring together all proponents of the World Parliamentary Body based on a common platform, because there was support for UNPA out there for a long time from different kind of actors, from different corners of the world and different institutions, but it was never, you know, coordinated, or there was never one platform that gave all this real leverage or even visibility. And this is what we want to do with the international campaign, that we actually build you know, a common voice around this idea. And by now, over 1,500 current and former members of parliament from over 120 countries in the world have endorsed the international appeal for UN Parliamentary Assembly. This appeal is probably the most important policy document because it captures what the supporters of the campaign endorse as a common denominator. And that's also how my work is informed in political terms as the campaign's director, because of course what we promote is the campaign's platform and not whatever comes to our mind. So there have been several international meetings on the UN Parliamentary Assembly in New York and Buenos Aires and Brussels and Geneva at the UN. The last one was in 2013 in the European Parliament. And I believe as we are approaching 2020, the 75th anniversary of the UN, we should seriously look into the possibility of having another international meeting on the UN Parliamentary Assembly next year or in 2020. An occasion really to augment and our efforts and to achieve big visibility, hopefully. Really just a few minutes more, if you allow. The goal of the campaign is to promote an intergovernmental preparatory process for UNPA, and you know, a couple of actors have endorsed this, like the Foreign Minister of Malta in November 2013, Federica Mogherini, when she was an Italian deputy. She is now the European Union's High Representative on Foreign Affairs, endorsed it. The UN independent expert for the promotion of an equitable and democratic international order endorsed this. In May 2017, we organized an information meeting in New York for UN missions, and for the first time I am aware of, ever actually, since the peace conference of Versailles after the First World War. This was a meeting where we had a dozen government representatives who were listening to us and, you know, to proponents of the World Parliament, and who were actually considering the matter. So this was a milestone that we will be building on. It was hosted by the Canadian mission at the UN, also a big milestone that we had this endorsement. And yesterday, the Foreign Affairs Minister of Ireland said that with regard, you know, that, let me quote it, that's better. In this regard, I have noted proposals for the establishment of a United Nations Parliamentary Assembly, and Ireland remains open-minded on the concept of such an assembly. So positions such as this is what we try to achieve, and this came, he came forward with this because of a parliamentary question that was put forward by one of our allies in the Irish Parliament. And this is really totally fresh from yesterday, something we will promote in, you know, in the coming weeks. Then just really 3 more points I would like to share with you. You know, the European Parliament was the first parliamentary body we are aware of that endorsed the UN Parliamentary Assembly project, and that was in 1994, yes? So, and in 2011, and there were more resolutions of this kind, the European Parliament reiterated its support, and we are again this year working with parliamentarians and the Foreign Affairs Commission of the European Parliament with the goal that it will reiterate its support in a plenary resolution coming forward in September on UN policy. And, you know, in the European Parliament, we also, it's not like it's, you know, it's automatically approved. There is a lot of skepticism there as well. And we are optimistic, however, that this time we will manage to get a strong language coming from the European Parliament on this idea. Then finally, you know, in terms of what can you do or what can we do to support the campaign, one thing is, of course, you know, to talk to representatives, elected representatives, legislators, but also it is very useful just to do simple, you know, events. For example, in the context of the Global Week of Action for World Parliament, that's been launched like a couple of years ago as a means for, you know, as a grassroots approach. I mean, like me, you can simply take a picture with yourself saying, you know, World Parliament Now, which is the week slogan, and put it on social media. That's certainly better than nothing, right? So this year's Week of Action will be from October 19 to 28. And finally, I see a potential for us to connect the project of the UN Parliamentary Assembly with the UN 2020 effort, which means that there are civil society organizations, including the Workable World Trust, that has been a major supporter of this, that promote an open and inclusive preparatory process for a reform summit in 2020. And this is, I promise, really the last point. Another new element in our work is the idea of a UN parliamentary network, which would be, again, something different from a UN parliamentary insofar as that it wouldn't be a fully fledged assembly necessarily composed by all, you know, delegates from all UN member states, but as a network, it would be open for participation by individual MPs, you know, who are just interested in being part of this. And this was a recommendation coming from the report of the Commission on Global Security, Justice and Governance, co-chaired by former US Secretary of State Madeleine Albright and former Nigerian Foreign Minister Ibrahim Gambari. And I believe that this network idea is really something we need to pursue, because although the Commission, and I agree with that, says that also such a network should be recognized by the UN, according to Article 22, it would not be this fully fledged, you know, assembly which foreign diplomats are afraid of to be open, okay? So the idea of a network is really something that also, you know, appeal to people, I believe, at this information meeting we had in May. Right, okay, I promise to finish here, and thanks so much, and I'm looking forward to the discussion.
Thank you, Andreas. That was outstanding. That was great. I am going to read 2 quotes from Joe's book to just sort of add before we start, and I'll let you know that I've already received little chat messages from Bob Flax and Gail Hughes that they have questions, so I'll let them go first. Actually, those of you on video, if you just physically raise your hand, I can see you and then call on you. And so, Evan, was that, you have a question as well? No, you were just demonstrating. Thank you. Those of you on the phone, I don't think you have access to chat, and you also don't, so you'll just have to pipe in with your voice saying that you'd like to ask a question. So let me read these couple things that I think add a little bit to what Andreas shared, which was outstanding, and that absolutely was not too long. First of all, we didn't start right on the hour, and besides that, everything you shared was really helpful to us. On page 42 of Joe's book, he says, in considering power within a WPA, one should recognize that influence derives not only from the number of seats to which individual countries or blocks of nations are entitled, but also from the soft power of example and ideas. The testimony of MWPs, that would be the parliamentarians, representing exemplary states will generally carry greater weight than declarations from failed or failing states. Similarly, MWPs recognized for their high moral standing, charisma, or oratorical skill, or issues-based expertise would, irrespective of their home state, be able to exercise influence out of proportion to their single vote. I mean, I just think that concept of soft power and the power of words would have even more impact within a parliamentary assembly than it does, say, in the General Assembly or anywhere else. So when we talk about weighted votings, realize there's that aspect as well. Joe also talked, page 43, he's saying among the positive aspects of the proposed system, one should recognize that the potential importance of engaging all parties in WPA discussions and exposing MWPs from non-democratic regimes, as well as from fledgling democracies, to dialogues on issues of global importance, thereby providing them with a template of how democratic government might be applied domestically. I think that's a strong argument for why we wouldn't want to, as Andreas said, somehow create this definition of what a democratic country would be, and not include the others. And he also said, this is my final point, additionally, to the extent that WPA debates would be publicized by the mass media, they would play an educative role, exposing concerned citizens worldwide to the viewpoints of spokespersons from countries other than their own. I just thought those were important thoughts as we're thinking about the value of this. So with that, all of you are muted, although Bob, I see you've already unmuted yourself. Very good. I'll call on Bob first. Those on the phone, you probably do *6 to unmute. And Gail, you should see the button on the lower, any of you that are on video, the lower right, if you hover over the bottom of your screen at the lower right, you'll see a mute and unmute button. All right, Bob, go ahead. And actually, we can't hear you, so interesting. You know, your video, you probably have to unmute your phone. Or let's see, I can.
How's that?
There we go.
Okay, great.
Yep.
Well, first, I want to thank you, Andreas, for joining us across the seas. That's wonderful, very informative. And Nancy for arranging this. That's great. I have 3 questions. In the interest of time, I'll just throw them all out together. And so first, just a statistic. Andreas, you mentioned that 129 of the smallest countries carry 2/3 majority in the General Assembly. And then you gave the number, I think it was either the number of people or some number after that. If you could repeat that statistic, that's question 1. Question 2 is, if you could just say a word or so, kind of strategically, where have you met the most resistance to this idea? And what have you found in terms of strategies that has been the most successful for you that other organizations out there like CGS might learn from? And the last question I have is we have a new board member. Unfortunately, she's not on right now. Her name is Sovita Maani Ewing, if I'm pronouncing her name correctly. She's a Baha'i and the author of a number of World Federalist books. And she made a comment a year or so ago at a meeting that was kind of surprising to me, because I'm a big proponent of the UNPA, but someone brought it up in this discussion, and she said something like, well, why would, you know, that she pointed out that the General Assembly is an advisory board, and she said, why would we want to create an advisory board to an advisory board, you know? And it kind of threw me, and I think everyone else in the room, no one had a comeback. So I think you've actually answered that, because that's only the first stage. But if there's anything more you can say about that, that would be interesting. So those are my three. Thank you.
Oh, I guess.
Oh, okay. Sound went off for a minute.
Huh.
Okay, shall I respond directly, or shall we collect more questions?
Well, you're writing them down. Sure. Gail, do you want to ask your question as well? Questions, and then maybe you could respond to those.
Okay, actually, my question is more of a comment, and it relates to what you were talking about regarding soft power. That I think a World Parliamentary Assembly, or for that matter, any global organization, will not work optimally unless we have people think of themselves as global statesmen who do more than represent whoever they're supposed to be representing. So this is what I think of as a cultural thing. You know, I've been promoting this concept of global statesmanship. And so, you know, structure is important, and they interact, because structures can generate changes in culture, but culture can generate support for changes in structure also. So I'm wondering if there's any attention to trying to promote this global citizenship and global statesmanship as part of this project.
Okay, and maybe due to time, the idea of collecting questions is a good one. Anyone on video, you can raise your hand. Okay, so Maya, why don't you go ahead,
Yeah.
Maya?
Yeah, so I have two questions, and yeah, thanks for the presentation. Has the campaign, or has Joseph Schwartzberg thought about the issue of education at the global level to include or ensure minimum standards if we're going to move towards one person, one vote approximately or totally at the global level? We need to have basic and good education, including global civics education for everybody in the world. And at this point, we're of course woefully well under that sort of state of affairs. But the SDGs, of course, have excellent goals for education. And sort of related to that is media, global media, national media. We know that there's a lot of propaganda, there's lots of meddling in various elections through unscrupulous media. So have you thought about that in your campaign or otherwise?
Shall I respond now? So it's not too much questions I collect?
Yes, go ahead. That's great, Andreas.
Thanks so much. It's really appreciated also your remarks, Nancy, at the beginning. And maybe, so because our time is short, I address questions directly. Bob, yes, it's those 129 countries that command a 2/3 majority. And I don't have it right now, but from the top of my head, it should be like 8.2% or something. But if you wish, I can, while we have a next round of points and questions, I can look it up, or I can send it to you. It's actually a number I use frequently. Because, I mean, of course, you know, it's a statistic. In reality, we know that they are not voting on bloc, and larger countries have means and ways to convince them to vote, and, you know, in certain ways. but it illustrates the whole problem, this imbalance. The other question was, well, where does the biggest resistance come from, and what can we do to overcome it? And I think there is support and resistance at many different levels and in many different dimensions. And what we need in terms of the campaign as a strategic goal is, in my view, a simple majority of the UN General Assembly that would, first of all, create a preparatory process, and eventually, as a result of that, would adopt the statutes of such an assembly. And the thing is, if I may say this openly, that practically zero foreign policy bureaucrats in capitals, foreign ministries are excited about this prospect of having a democratic body added to the General Assembly. And so this is big time resistance that we see, that, even if you can come up with the best arguments for all issues, including funding, which is one of the first things they come up with, it's always like it doesn't help, because the problem is not a problem of arguments, but it's a political problem. So and how can we overcome that? I think the only way we can achieve this, it's not us publishing literature and even improving our arguments further and all. It's that what we will need is political support from the public, however that can be expressed. And just one example from Switzerland in 2005, a majority of members of both chambers in Switzerland signed an open letter to then Kofi Annan and requested him to put the UN Parliamentary Assembly proposal on the official UN reform agenda. And, we did a routine press conference and didn't, give it much thought that it would be a big thing. But eventually, in the course of 1 week, this open letter of Swiss parliamentarians was all across the nation's media, everywhere on page 2, 3, and 4. And then the Swiss government suddenly said, "Oh, this is a good proposal." The Swiss UN ambassador in an interview said, "This is totally in line with Swiss foreign policy, and we need to support it," and so on and so forth. And they only did this because they sensed it's popular, right? So, and that's why such things like this Global Week of Action, how small it might be today, are important, because it is an instrument, a mechanism for us to try to, create popular support. And I don't think that anything else will really help. Of course, advocacy and all, and us creating better infrastructure in terms of a campaign and civil society organizations and all. But the bottom line is that it all is directed at, creating popular support that would force politicians or convince politicians, to put it in a positive way, to pursue this. The other question was about the Baha'i. Why would we want to establish an advisory board of an advisory board? I mean, an advisory body. And I mean, which is, the logic is true.
Sorry,
Yes?
Can I just say, I'm a Baha'i, but that has nothing to do with the Baha'i belief. That's Soveda's. I know Soveda. That was probably just her question.
Hi, I'm actually, I can speak. This is Soveda here.
Is it Soveda?
Oh, great. Great.
Hi, Andreas. Thank you very much for your book. I just to be clear, I'm fully, in support of Maya's point, the Baha'i faith is fully in support of the creation of a UN Parliamentary Assembly. The question was, what shape does it take? And if we're going to throw this out to the world, to have it put in a form that people won't come back and say, well, gee, what's the point of having an advisory board, a body to an advisory body? If we're going to create a UN Parliamentary Assembly, it should be something that has teeth, that's capable of legislation, that is truly representative of the peoples of the world, et cetera, et cetera. And in fact, I wrote about this in my book, Collective Security Within Reach, that was published in 2008. There's a whole section on the need for a UN Parliamentary Assembly. and in my subsequent book, Building a World Federation, published in 2015. So again, I agree. I don't want this any misunderstandings about the Baha'i viewpoint on the need for a parliamentary assembly. This was touted already and proposed in 1863, and I hope that it's part of the literature that you so exhaustively covered in section 1 of your book, which I have and I'm very eager to read. So thank you very much. Just wanted to clarify. Sorry about that.
Yeah, that's fine, and great to have you here. It's really appreciated. Very good, right? And I mean, after all, the point is a good one. Really, if you look at it, you know, from a logical point of view, why would we like to establish an advisory body without teeth? And I think there, you know, the question, you gave part of a response yourself. The one consequence could be to say, right, what we intend to do is to achieve the best possible outcome as quickly as possible. So considering political resistance that we have, the General Assembly is the best, in my view, starting point. And then I would add that we shouldn't underestimate what the UN General Assembly is doing and what powers it has. At least, I mean, of course, it's not a global legislative body, but it does have distinct functions and powers within the system, like adopting the UN's budget, electing the UN Secretary General. It has the power to, you know, come forward with questions to the Security Council. It can launch initiatives at the International Court of Justice. It commands the budget of, you know, peacekeeping operations partly, and so on. So I would argue the General Assembly is not that toothless like we often believe it to be. And then again, of course, the main response is to say, right, this is just a starting point. And the actual goal is that together with the General Assembly, you know, this new body would actually pave the way towards a system that has tooth. That's the kind of response I would give. And it's great to have you here. But I don't want to miss, of course, the other question.
Yeah. So I'm going to ask now if any of the folks on the phone have questions. And Blake, I see your box. Oh, and Maya. Okay, Maya wants to say something more.
No, my questions weren't answered.
That's the thing.
That's what I wanted to say.
Thank you.
Yeah. Right, because we had Gail and Maya's comments still. And of course, I mean, Gail, you mentioned and that was echoed by Nancy before, the need of global statesmanship and I guess of extraordinary political skills and expression. And I think this is, of course, an important point. The success that an initial parliamentary assembly at the UN may have is really closely connected to who will be in the assembly in terms of representatives and delegates. And a lot of delegates will probably be there for whatever reason, you know, that is not obvious, but some will be there because they actually want to be in this body to push it forward and because they believe in global citizenship. And if we look at the example of the European Parliament, I have to admit we do have the expectation that there would be a core group of real progressive and good representatives, a core group, right? Not necessarily the majority, but a core group that is pushing forward with global, you know, with a global perspective, and is also pushing forward the development of the UNPA itself. In the European Parliament, for instance, there was in 1984, they produced a constitutional draft for the European Union in face of, you know, the desperate situation in the intergovernmental bodies of the then European Economic Community. And they actually, you know, the initiative of the European Parliament at the time paved the way towards the EU adopting the principle of majority voting, qualified majority voting. So I think that inside the UNPA, these progressive forces will be important to do exactly what you commented, both to help create a progressive, you know, dimension in global public opinion and to be able to express this in a global body of this kind. And of course, I think especially if we look at the vision that we pursue, the idea of a popularly elected world parliament, this is, I believe, far in the future, because indeed I would support fully what has been said. This is connected with many preconditions, including education. It's also including this necessity that all delegates are democratically elected, and think it through. It actually, what we are saying is that we can only really have this if China has been democratized, It's kind of revolutionary, because unless we can have free and fair elections for World Parliament also in China, the whole idea of a World Parliament that adopts global binding, law will not work. So there are many preconditions, and global education is just one of them, of course, an important one. But I believe that creating a UN Parliamentary Assembly that has only limited power will help build, global consciousness. I believe that the development of consciousness and social institutions are interconnected, because more and more people will be able to identify with the UN and what the UN is doing if there is a body they can identify with, which in this case then would be the Parliamentary Assembly, the representatives of which they are voting for. So there would be this direct connection, and step, we would expect that this Parliamentary Assembly, or let's say we would hope that the Parliamentary Assembly would also help increase global consciousness and so on. And this also, there is the same, I guess, interconnection in terms of global media, right? Because, we don't have a real global public sphere today, and institutions like the World Economic Forum in Davos, they get a lot of attention, or formally, I have to say, meetings like the World Social Forum, but and of course UN meetings and intergovernmental negotiations. But imagine if we had an elected assembly, and in addition to this, I would hope and expect that it would attract media, so that there would be new global voices, and and delegates there would be able also to raise concerns in front of the global media. It's a difference whether a member of parliament from Kenya complains about UN habitat activities in Nairobi in his national parliament, or whether he's able to do so in a global parliament, right, where he has a completely different audience. Nobody cares about what he says, in global terms, if he raises a question in the parliament of Kenya, but the effect and leverage might be much greater if he does so in a global assembly. So I think this is, again, interrelated. Right, I hope I have covered it all as best as I could at this point.
I am going to ask again for questions, and there's really no reason why we have to end precisely at 12:30. Of course, anyone can leave the meeting at any time, but if there's further questions, I don't want to just cut off the discussion. But let me just say a few wrap-up points, because some of you will be leaving. The next session is going to be on Saturday, June 9th. The topic will be reform of the Security Council, and Florencia Gore will be our moderator that time. And all of you are now on my list, so unless you request to not be on the list, you will get word about that. We only plan these first 4 sessions, and then after that we hadn't planned dates. So I will be sending you an email. I'm suggesting we skip July and August because everyone's so busy in the summer months. Start up in September. And the first 4 I felt was very important to sort of follow the order of the book. Those are 4 core topics. But at this point, I'm inclined to skip around, and especially if certain months a topic is important, let's do that one. So again, I'm going to suggest a schedule. You can get back to me, especially if this time of second Saturday at the time frame we're in your time zone is not good. You can suggest something, but I thought that, my schedule here, I thought next time in September we could do engaging civil society. That's an important month at the General Assembly. It may be when the UN 2020 process is actually getting approved with a resolution with the General Assembly. Then I thought next we could do human rights system. I'll send this out to you, don't worry. And then peace building, peacekeeping, disarmament, responsibility to protect. That would be the next month. Judicial system. I'm thinking we do September, October, November, just skip December, start up in January. I'm thinking we'll just not cover a few of the topics that are a little more dry and organizational only. So we'd wrap this up in May. Anyway, I'll send that out to you. Please give me your input. And all of these talks are recorded, so I'll get you that information too. You can watch this or any of the other sessions. With that, I'm going to call on anyone who has a further question. Those of you on the phone, even if you had unmuted yourself, I might have muted you again because there's a little background noise. You might have to do *6. And I'm getting a chat message from Bob.
This is Blake. You have me in the queue, I think, already.
Yeah, Q. Oh, so Blake, I hadn't heard that you wanted to talk, but I was seeing your box flash quite a bit. So go ahead. And Bob, I will read your message as well after Blake talks.
Andreas, since becoming involved in the UNPA campaign in 2007 with the launch, I've been, as you know, because we've spoken about this, I've spoken a lot about the idea of a treaty, and I'm glad you brought it up today, although you were very careful and selective, and your comments were limited, really, the scope of it, indicated an intention to limit the scope, or a recommendation to limit the scope to be quite narrow, and I would say safe. And I don't want to beat up things on how I think I could expand it, but I also note that in these sorts of deliberations and discussions with parliamentarians and so on, there's a requirement for diplomatic language, and we've touched on a couple of times with very obtuse language about what really is confronting us as challenges from global leaders, specifically a few particularly, and the global events and so on lead us to speculate about what obstacles might be in the way. But I wonder if you see that there's any potential for getting around those obstacles with a UNPA by rallying international enthusiasm because of a sense that there is a global tyranny rising. Is there any way to do that while still maintaining diplomatic language? Do you see that there's a trend about that isn't being spoken specifically about, but that people are actually perhaps bending your ear a little bit about it, saying that there's an opportunity for perhaps these very state actors being concerned about aggression, for instance, and things like that? I'd just leave that with you.
Should I respond directly? Because
go ahead, but let me read Bob Flax's comment before people might get off. I just want Bob, because Bob brought up a question. Anyway, he says, I just want to clarify that in my question earlier, I in no way meant to imply that the Baha'i faith is not in favor of the UNPA. Thanks, Bob. So we've got that very clear, and we're very happy that Sovaida was here with us to clarify that as well. Okay, go ahead, Andreas.
Right, thanks, Blake, and nice to meeting you today. Right, I think, the key here is probably that we recognize that complementary approaches are possible and necessary, So we do have this platform of the International Campaign for UN Parliamentary Assembly, which does indeed have a limited scope, which was part of why it was a success so far, I think. Because whenever you add an item, whatever it might be, you add the possibility of division, right? So that people drop off the train and don't want to be involved anymore. So really the key was that we were concentrating on this one thing and didn't broaden the scope much. Having said that, still, working with other platforms and civil society organizations, it is absolutely possible to come forward with stronger language and more radical grassroots approaches. And in fact, I encourage everybody to do that. It's just not that the Campaign for UN Parliamentary Assembly is, I believe, the right place to do it. To give you one example, Democracy Without Borders is our new transformed organization here that has, been working on the UNPA campaign for a long time. But we decided that we also, in addition to this, without any change to the UNPA campaign, want to work on other projects as well, and that are more radical in terms of democratic participation at the UN. So I would like, I encourage you to pursue this further in other NGOs and civil society organizations. And eventually, I think it's complementary. The stronger the pressure is, and if it's connected with a broader scope, why not? But the stronger the pressure for global democratization is coming from different perspectives and different places, the higher the likelihood is that one of these approaches will finally be successful. And I would be optimistic that the UNPA might be one of them, right? Yeah, that was my response.
Bob Flax, I'm going to call on you to share your thought, which is directly related on your own. Oops, you're muted. Your phone is muted, I guess.
Okay, what about now? Okay. Yeah, no, I was just saying that for those of you who don't have the chat box open, that in the field of social psychology, there's a principle called the foot in the door technique, which is basically, it's a phrase taken from salespeople who, when you open the door, you kind of put your foot in so they can't close the door. And the idea is you start something small in a non-threatening way. And once people are comfortable with it and begin to see the value, even though maybe ideologically they may not have agreed with it initially, that once they see it's safe and actually produces some good, then you could expand from there. So the point that I was making is in Joe's book and in what Andreas is talking about, that they're drawing on that psychological principle, starting small and safe and expanding from there. Thank you.
Great. Anyone else have anything else they'd like to share? I think we're winding down. So you all have Andreas's email address because I included it in the group message that I sent out this morning. So feel free to send comments, questions to the full group or to Andreas himself, and I'm sure he'd be happy to respond. So Andreas, I really want to thank you so much for a really absolutely wonderful talk today and discussion. Let's give him a hand, huh? And this, I think this is a great video too. The sound quality for Zoom meetings is really good, the recordings. So I think that we can choose clips of this or the whole thing. I'll certainly share the whole thing on the Workable World Trust website, and I'll give you all the links to that. But this may provide you with some good footage also, Andreas. All right, with that, I will say goodbye for this month, and thank you everyone for joining. Bye-bye.